In this video, I want to talk about forms. In particular, I want to talk about forms that aren't controlled, are not controlled within React, and how we can end up using forms that are not controlled in certain situations. So here I've got very basic React application, just grabbing everything from the CDN. Here's my horizontal rule, and I'm going to create an app with some data that has a little bit of state. Again, we can imagine that this state is going to be coming from the server. Maybe we're making some AJAX calls to get the data. And since it's going to have some state, I'm going to have it extend React component. And in my constructor, I'm going to call super. And I'm going to set the state with some items. I'm going to keep this really as simple as I can. Each item is going to end up having an ID. So we'll have an ID of 1. And we're just going to give it a value. And these are just going to be, just to keep it as simple as possible, these are just going to be string values. I'm going to give this a value of 3. I'm going to give this a value of 4. And I'll give this a value of 7. I'm just sort of making up the data. And here, here's our state. And let's actually put in our render method. And here we'll return. And let's put in a div here. Let's just do that for the moment. Make sure I don't have any errors here. That shows up. And so what we're going to do is we're going to want to render some controls that end up using this state. And we want to be able to change the values of this state. Again, we could imagine that these changes will end up going up to the server. But for the moment, we just want to be able to display those values. So we could loop over our items. Let's destructure this here. And we're going to end up doing a mapping. And we'll have some component called item, where we'll pass in our item. And this is going to want to have a key, so we'll say that the key is going to be the item ID. And we'll go up here and we'll start setting up our item. For the moment, let's just make sure that we actually have something coming back here. Let's just do our handy horizontal rule. And we should end up seeing 3 of them, which we do. And what we're going to do here is let's have a div. And within the div, let's put an h1 tag. We're passing in our item. I'm going to destructure it right here. And let's just display the value. So we've got our values there, and what we want to do is we want to create some options where the user can end up selecting the value. So we're going to have a select, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop over an array 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm going to map over it. This is going to be a number. Let's call it num. Doesn't like that. And this will be an option. The key will be num. And we'll display the num. Close off the option tag. Close off the map. And let's make sure that we put this inside of our braces so that it ends up getting evaluated by React. And let's take a look and see what we have there. So we've got this select object. Yeah, let's make it a little bigger here. Let's say if you're a select, let's make your height okay. So we've got our objects here. Again, nothing is corresponding to our values, but I'm going to use an uncontrolled component. And for the uncontrolled component, what I'm going to do is React says this is not a controlled component. Don't use the value. So if I went over here and I said the value is going to be the item's value, and I refresh over here, first of all, React is going to tell me that I've got to have an on change event here, which I could end up putting here, so I can't really change my values anyway. And what I'm going to do instead of doing the value, it's going to say default value. Should end up giving me the same thing. It's basically default value. I can do that for an uncontrolled component. So the bottom line is that I have no state that I'm using here. And I'm going to assume that I can pass in an onChange event here. It doesn't exist yet. And I'm going to put this right in line so that when this ends up changing, again, keep in mind what I end up getting. I'm going to put a callback function here. And what I end up getting is an event, and I can find out the value that ended up changing. And what I'm going to end up passing back, I'm going to assume that I have an onChange method. And I'm going to pass back not only the item that I'm editing, but also its new value, which is going to be ev.target.value. Now again, I haven't passed in an onChange, but I'm going to end up doing that here. I'm going to want to end up changing the state, so I'm going to end up having to bind this. So again, this onChange is going to be called with an item and a new value. I'll say this onChange equals this onChange dot bind this, and I'm just going to console.log the item and the value. And if I end up refreshing this and I go and I change a value, oh, I need to actually now grab, I have to remember that onChange I'm getting from this. And so I'm going to need to pass it here. And when I do that, hopefully this time around, I'll see the new value. So the old value is 4, the new value is 7. But notice it's not showing up as 7 here because, again, even though I changed it in this uncontrolled component, my state is higher up and I need to change it on the state. Again, we would probably end up calling something on the back end, making sure that our data was going to be saved on the server. The only thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to now say, hey, look, my items is whatever the state.items was before, and I'm going to map it. And for every item, and I'm going to use a underscore item here, for every item that was here, I'm going to modify my state. So in other words, if I'm looping over the item, and the item that I'm looping over, if its ID is not equal to the ID of the item that's passed in here, well, no change. Return the item. Otherwise, I'm going to return, I'm just going to use this splat operator. I'm going to say whatever the item was before, and now we want to end up setting the new value on that item. There's other ways you could do this. You could end up doing this with object assign, but all I'm doing now is I'm modifying, I'm not even really modifying, I'm basically taking whatever the properties were for that item that was passed in, and I'm putting it on the new value. And now what I'm going to do is I've got these new items, and I'm going to set the state for those items. So now if I end up going back here, and I change this, so the big difference here, hopefully, is I change this to a 7, and the new state gets changed to a 7. So that's the whole idea of actually having, we always think that when we have a form that we have to have a controlled component. But again, if all we're doing is changing the value, we could really get away with having an uncontrolled component. We don't have, if we wanted to do something like putting a button there and saying, hey, look, we're not going to allow you to change this value. If we had a button that said save and we wanted to, put some disabling on it based on some conditions, then we can't do it because we have an uncontrolled component. But this ends up working out really just fine. So in another video, I'll talk to you about in what cases we would need to have a controlled component in a similar situation.